Hey, what's up, Liron here. Today we're going to learn together how to stop obsessing over colors. This is something I hear all the time from my students, people in from here in comments and emails and everywhere. This idea of what color should I use that people find just crippling and makes them not begin the painting or overthink all of the stages. So let me show you what I'm doing here. I'm doing something very unique. I'm actually pre-wetting both sides of the paper, which is something I wanted to try for a while now, and I know it should allow the paper to stay wet for longer and allow for a bit more of an extreme version of wet in wet with lots more control. Now look at my palette. Extremely dirty, full of just crap, let's be honest. Usually I'll clean it better than this, but for this video I want to show you how I don't clean it at all. And look at how shiny this is. This is how wet it should be. And I'm using hot press paper. We will talk a bit about the nuances of doing that because there is quite a lot here. But just know that the technique that allows to have better control and better flow when working on hot press is wet and wet. That's gonna be your main thing, using a lot of water. Even when you're doing wet on dry, you're starting with a very wet wash and then slowly putting in darker paint into that, okay? Which is kind of what I'm doing here. I pre-wet the paper and now I'm starting to put in. One of the key things here is that shadow on the side of the face, and that's something I really wanted to capture, that edge that's going to be smooth thanks to our technique. And I find that once you get the nuances of hot press paper, you'll be able to really blend these types of edges. Look at how much the brush makes them softer. There's a lot you can do with hot press paper, and I'm slowly learning to love it and make better use of it. And look at how still very wet this is. Now, onto the topic at hand. Look at my palette. It's extremely dirty, and I'm using a completely random assortment of colors here. So I put a bit of Pyrrole Scarlet together with neutral tint, together with a bit of yellow ochre, together with everything. There's everything here. This red even has a bit of green in it. And you'll notice how it's just not that big of a deal, because the core principle of creating realism is about the shapes and the values, right? And if you follow these two, you will be able to create a beautiful impression. Does not matter what colors you use. Now, it doesn't mean colors have no role. Of course they play a role. Of course they have influence over the feel of the painting, over the composition, over the focal point, over everything. But even if we remove it completely from the equation and just use it kind of crazy, like here, it will still work as long as you follow the basic principles, okay? So let me show you. And again, a bit of Pyrrole Scarlet with that mud, disgusting mix that was already there. I'm still working wet and wet. The paper is still wet. And right now I'm establishing where the hair transitions from a light to dark. Right, top is light, bottom is dark. There's a lot of shadow under the hair that connects to the shadow with the eye socket and the ear and everything, and the side of the face that's farther from us. So you want to essentially connect everything together. Now I added a bit of yellow ochre and a bit of lemon yellow. You know, I'm using whatever I have there, and you'll see me adding some more bizarre paints soon. And to be honest with you, at this point in particular, there isn't too much thought as to where I use every mix. Like, where do I use warm? Where do I use cool? It's mostly a big mess. Later on, if I'm being honest, I am making use of best practices, right? But for the most part here, there's nothing there. So a bit of blue there in the background, but it's mixed with so many things. It's mixed with a bit of carbazole violet in there. It's just a big mess, to be honest with you. And everything here is done wet and wet. And look at how much time you have. We're like 4 minutes into the video, but it's actually closer to 6 or 7 minutes in real time, because I cut out just a few of the boring stages, and it's still wet. It's still workable because we pre-wet both sides. I played around with it a bit in the past, kind of liked it. I didn't get to talk about it too much because I wanted to further develop my skill with it, but you have time. Right, you have time. And what I find a bit tricky about this kind of a work method is you do need to transition slowly to darker values. You can't just jump to the darkest darks. You need to slowly, while the paint dries, add a bit more darkness to the mix, and a bit more. And by the way, lifting, that's an advantage with hot press paper. It was very easy for me to lift these areas because everything stays on the surface. But in any case, here is our initial wash. Beautiful, just establishes everything really well. Here's a mix. This is the epitome of mud. I have everything here. I put here literally everything. Green, red, blue, purple. everything. A bit of opaque paint too that was left over, my Joan Brilliant opaque paint, doesn't matter. I use it freely however I want, okay? Here's what does matter. These shapes I'm putting in, following the patterns of light and shadow. I have not mentioned it, but you can find the sketch. It's in the description, my sketch. Feel free to trace based on that, recreate it, paint along with me. You'll find a reference photo there, everything you need. And you just follow these shapes that you place there. Then you can do some fancy stuff like playing around with the edges like I'm doing here and really paying attention to where everything is, right? This is a bit of a softer edge there between the eyebrow and the eye socket. There's a soft transition. Soften these up. Now here's my timing's a little off, so I'm mixing a bit of a stronger paint and then I'm gonna gradually darken some parts. Now I don't skip almost anything in this particular stage. I want you to see my process. I'm slowly pushing the color to be a little stronger where it needs to be. I'm also playing around with the angle of paper to make sure it doesn't flow down too much because I don't need a downward flow right now. But one thing to note is, again, that work method with hot press paper, if you're having a really hard time getting an even wash, the magic is to start always with either just pure clean water or a very light wash. So if you start with clean water and you pre-wet the paper, a lot of water, do 2 passings over it. I did a bit more extreme here, wet the underside of the paint of the paper too. Or you can start with a paint like here, like I'm doing here, but have it very light, lighter than it needs to be, and just be aware that it's okay and you'll darken it gradually. But the starting point, the most effective starting point for hot press paper is a very wet surface, okay? If you try to paint just directly with a dark value over the paper, you'll get all of the streaks of the brush and it will dry unevenly and it's going to be a big mess, okay? Now I'm doing some more wet and wet, and remember what I told you, you can't jump straight to the darkest value, and I kind of did that here, which wasn't the right move. So what you'll see me do in a second is bring out my spray bottle and help it spread out a bit, and also introduce some mid values that aren't as dark as what I just put here as a spray, values that aren't as dark as what I put here, but also darker than the baseline, the first wash I put, what I'm doing right now. That's the nuance. It's not easy to control all of this wet and wet, but it is possible. It's very much possible, and hot press has a lot of upsides when you do that kind of a thing. Now look at my colors here. It's mostly grays, mostly neutrals, not too much thought. You know, part of the hair is yellow, part of the hair is red, part of the face is blue. The background is blue. I'll give myself some credit for actually putting a paint there that makes sense, but for the most part it's all just a mix, you know. And I'm really playing within those grays, and what this does is runs the risk of having a very off color harmony, you know, allegedly. But what I find is that if you nail everything else, no one will question it. And the color harmony, even if it's not there by the book, you didn't use complementaries, you didn't place the colors in the most effective place, it's not going to matter. No one will care. No one will notice. It will look beautiful. Now look at what I'm doing here. Pre-wetting where I want a soft edge on the tip of the nose and the side here. And now I'm starting to put in paint into this pre-wet area. And this is one of the best ways to create a soft edge, especially again in hot press paper. If you plan on putting a wash and then blending its edge, you're in for a rude awakening, because it may work. But for the most part, it's big trouble. This is mid-vid Liron. I just want to give a moment and recommend you check out the frustration-free watercolor course. You can find a link in the description box below. Again, if you want to let go of that rigidness, using these means of, again, not caring so much about the color, not being so obsessed over it and worried that it's not going to work, and really overthinking and overcomplicating, frustration-free watercolor course is the one for you. And if you want to dive deeper into values and shapes and realism and actually be able to always produce a realistic result, be sure to check out the Watercolor Realism course. All the links are in the description box below. And now let's get back to the process. So on we go. Thank you for sticking around for that little intermission. And I'm starting to bring in some more neutrals, right? I'm bringing in a bit more blue here. I used both phthalo, both French ultramarine, whatever my brush kind of caught, whatever my brush brushed against, really. And just gradually building it up, pushing it from light to dark, closing in, because some areas that are currently paper white or very light shouldn't be. So you see me bringing out that highlight on the tip of the nose that I lifted earlier by putting in those very light to mid-light values. Okay, this isn't even the mid values. This is the T values that kind of work in between. Ideally, if you can get all of these wet and wet, that's perfect, but I find it very challenging still. But yeah, so that kind of closes off the highlight on the tip of the nose. I had to get a real close look there. And now we can start slowly and gradually mixing some darker values. Now, I went too fast for that nostril. That's no good. What I'll have to do is mix a bit of a lighter wash, cover the whole thing up, and then add, because everything there should be a little darker, and you'll see me kind of gradually fixing it, going over everything, and that's okay. You know, hot press paper, again, it allows you to do that if you start wet enough. Now I'm bringing in a bit of Carbazole Violet. Who would have thought? Just putting it in there. Also, I recognize a bit of sap green in there. Not even sure where I got that, probably by mistake, but you know, it doesn't matter for this process. That's exactly the point. And all of these grays are not graceful. They don't work together in theory, right? I don't do here, and I want to make a distinction. If you look at someone like Joseph's Bookfitch, I'm not doing what he does, and again, pre-wetting for a soft edge. I'm not doing what Joseph's Bookfitch does, which actually is to care about the exact grays he mixes. I am using my intuition here and there, but for the most part, I'm kind of reaching to whatever I can grab off the palette. And I've shown you this many times before, you know, just using whatever color you want and all of the colors and having very strong saturation. I want to show you here that even in the nuanced grays, it doesn't matter as much. I'm going to bring in this. Here I added a bit of quinacridone rose, and maybe you can recognize the touch of it there. Just a really bit of it. My paints are all over in terms of brands too. I actually have some Daniel Smith. I have some M. Graham. I have some, I believe I even poured here some White Knights. So my colors, the brand themselves are also all over the place. And sorry for the weird cut. I don't know why it stopped recording. So all of these, you take these into account. And you have to come to the conclusion that colors, while important, while useful as a tool, aren't just that important for the end result of, let's say, achieving realism. Now, I want to show you something really cool here, because this is probably the only place where I did something a little more deliberate. I'm actually missing a bit of a flesh tone or something, a bit red there. So I'm glazing red over this, and this red is a mix of pretty much everything once again. Again, mud. No real such a thing. If we're being honest, it's more about like the nuanced gray and browns you mix, and if they work, they work. But I did miss a bit of warmth on that cheek or just anywhere. So I broke off the rest of the grays with a bit of that. But again, it was a bunch of, you know, random quinacridone rose, pyrrole scarlet, yellow ochre, whatever I could grab. Here I'm blending with my other brush, just softening a bit of that edge. Now here we have to be really bold and brave. Where that plane shift happens, where it's the bottom under the chin, that's where you really have to put in that strong shadow, and it looks very strong right now. Look at the bead, by the way. This is beautiful. This is so great. This is the way to work with that kind of paper. Again, you need to have a lot of flow, much more than you would in cold press, actually. But now it will start making more sense once it melts a bit. You see that actually that shadow does belong there, and it shows again that transition from the front or, you know, side plane of the face to the bottom. And that's a very common pattern. If you paint enough portraits, you'll start kind of figuring out the common patterns of portraits where, you know, that shadow on the nose, that shadow on the cheek, very, very common. Regardless of the direction of the light, really, these things are just there, right? So yeah, I'm lifting a bit of that, you know, there are muscles there, so I'm trying to convey their mass. This side should be darker, so again, we do care about values, right? So I'm just using a bit of a mix of phthalo blue, ultramarine to bring it back. There's this weird tendon or muscle there, I brought that back too, and I just don't want to have just a bunch of white space at the bottom, so I am bringing in a bit more color there to not have too much attention go there. Again, this is the very edge of the painting. I don't care much about it, okay? Hair. It's really dark around the bottom. Now, you'll notice one thing. I am working a bit higher key than the reference photo. I just find that I don't enjoy sometimes strong contrasts in the context of this painting. Okay, in this particular subject, it's hard for me to explain, but everything that goes around the hair, when it's that strong, I don't enjoy it as much. So I am making it a little higher key, and maybe this could be the hot press paper psychology that gets into my head and makes me paint a little differently. But overall, yeah, I am, and I'm connecting it to what we painted earlier, adding a bit of warmth, kind of to connect, to match what I have there, but it really doesn't matter as much. There's a bit of that, I don't know, sideburn, not really sideburn, but a bit of the hair here that I'm gonna bring some paint into. We're gonna darken the ear, and we're gonna do all of this wet and wet pretty much in one go. And in fact, you'll see in just a few moments, we're gonna do the same for the background. We're really close to the end of this process. We're gonna do the same for the background and merge it together with what we've got, you'll see in a few moments. Now, here, it's a bit hard to explain how I work this section for this part and the wet and wet that I'm going to do in just one moment. I really work off of intuition. I'm not even looking at the painting as much, so I'm kind of just figuring out where would be a nice place to put some curls in, just that will complement the composition. Again, I'm trying not to go super dark, even though some of these areas look dark. Again, you don't want to jump from just the T wet and wet onto the darkest dark unless there's a reason to do that. Here there isn't really a reason to do that. There needs to be something in between, like a mid value. So for some spots I got it right, for others I'm using the sprayer to just help it move. We're going to push some of the shadow a little lower, and then we're going to start after putting just a few more wet and wet touches, we're going to start working on the background. To be honest with you, I wasn't sure I'm going to work on the background just now, but then it felt just like the right thing to do because the hair is still wet, okay? Again, plenty of spray just to help it move a bit and see where that puts us. I've just been enjoying that technique of lots of freedom in the wet and wets, and it kind of will work itself out. It takes a bit of getting used to and a bit of courage, but I mean, courage, that's a matter of decision, really. So I'm cooling up the background like I did before. That's the one thing that I did kind of want to do, because everything almost about the sculpture is pretty warm. So I thought, let's contrast. And that's a best practice in a way. You know, you got to do it right, but it usually works out. And notice how the hair flows into that background because the hair was still wet. And that's exactly what I was after, to get that smooth edge there. Adding a bit of sap green has nothing to do with anything. Again, all of my grays are all over the place. They don't feel too connected, but one thing that does play in my favor is the fact that I'm using a big mixing area, and it's still quite organic because I'm still reaching into the same mixing area. So next up, if I add a bit of red or whatever, it's still going to have a bit of that green from earlier, and this connects to why I almost never clean my palette. You just don't need to, unless you're really trying to create a very bright, specific color for a specific use. You don't need it. And if you're just using bright, specific colors for the entirety of your painting, you actually run the risk of it looking a little amateurish and too strong or too out of balance, right? Again, I'm not gonna stick to any rules necessarily. It's a matter of choice and personal taste, but I'm just saying that's one of the risks you run into. Okay, now to really drive the point home, I'm actually going to sign this in just one moment using just colorful colors, lots of them. I do want to spread this out a bit because it feels like too dark of a spot in the corner of the painting. It's a little distracting. It's a bit of a dangerous move there and maybe not the right decision, but it's okay. Not the most correct decision, so to speak. In any case, here is, again, me signing this, using tons of colors, at least 3 or 4. There's phthalo blue, whatever, everything there. And here is the final result. I really hope this puts colors in the right context, the helpful context, a context that isn't scared, isn't rigid, isn't worried, but rather a context that is easygoing, loose, free. And from that point of strength, you can actually make better decisions when you mix your colors because you don't do it out of fear or out of timidness. Timidness kills paintings. It really does. You're doing it out of choice and out of desire to create. Okay, so that's the point of today. I hope you enjoyed this one. Don't forget, and I'll be super grateful if you check out the courses in the description box below. That's the sponsor of this video. So thank you so much for that. Leave a like, leave a comment. Let me know your thoughts on this. Is this something you're struggling with? I'm actually curious to hear, because I do hear this a lot, and I'm pretty connected to your struggle. So yeah. But in any case, I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much. Take care.